All right, good to see y'all. You may be seated. I've got to give you a little background on, well, first of all, it's great to be back. I want to give you a little background on how we got to this sermon series that we're going to start today. And Russ already said you can turn to the book of Ruth. It's the 6th book in your Bible, starting at the front. And so here's what was happening. In the spring, we got together, those who have preaching duties. So we had Russ and Troy and Jesse and I in a room, and we were talking about the preaching schedule. I like to be about 6 months out. And there's several reasons for that, but one of them is that way if I'm about 6 months out, I'm always thinking about that, and things come together a lot better that way. So we were talking, and we said, well, what do we need to talk about? And as we got to talking, we said, you know what, there's 3 Christian movies coming out. Wouldn't it be good to do a sermon series around those Christian movies? Let's call it At the Movies, and talk about a biblical perspective from that. And even though I wasn't here for those, I got to tell you, I think our 3 guys did an awesome job taking those, looking at them biblically, and I really enjoyed that series. We kept talking, and we said, you know, prayer. We hadn't talked about prayer in a while. That's one of those you better recycle on a regular basis. And then we said, but let's wait till everybody gets back from school, and we'll do prayer in the fall, and we do. We're going to have a series on prayer coming up. And then we said, well, what about, what it means to be a part of the family of God and the privileges of that, and what all that means. And so we thought, man, that resonated with everybody. We're going to do one here in about 4 weeks. It's called All in the Family. And we may take a little, opening like Archie Bunker style. I don't know. We're going to have some fun with that. But what does it mean to be a part of God's family? And that's going to be a great series. But we had 4 weeks that we needed to fill this week and for the next 3 weeks. So we're going around the room, and you got 4 guys in the room. So I'm going, what do y'all think? And Troy's going, well, what about Gideon and getting his army down to 300 and the battle and all of that? And Russ is saying, how about Samson, man? Let's do Samson or maybe even Joshua and Jericho, a great military battle. And I'm saying, look, I want to do 2 Kings where Elisha, the prophet, is being made fun of by these kids, and he calls a bear out of the woods and they maul the kids. I want to do that sermon one day, all right? And so then we're talking about all these manly things, and all of a sudden Jesse goes, how about Ruth? Well, there was silence in there, okay? And if you don't understand why, let me just kind of give you a picture you may understand. What if the same 4 of us were standing around on a Friday afternoon saying, let's go to the movie tonight. What movie do you want to go see? And I would say, let's go see Expendables, because these guys aren't going to live that much longer, right? This is probably one of their last movies. Let's go see that. And Russ says, let's go see Godzilla. I want to see that. And Troy says, no, let's go see Transformers. And Jesse goes, how about The Notebook? All right? That would not go well. Well, theologically, that's kind of what it was like for Jesse to go Ruth, right? Because it is a chick flick. And so we kind of stared at him for a second, wondering what world are you living in? And then we went on discussing what we were going to do. And I had all my ideas down on a 3x5 card. About a week later, I was praying. I said, God, how about, Jeremiah? How about Nehemiah and building the wall? Well, we're going to do Ruth, all right? So Jesse and God trumped my desire, and we're going to walk through the next 4 weeks this book of Ruth. And I will say this, I've never preached on it before, but I have come to love and appreciate this book, and it's got lessons in there for all of us. In fact, in 2 weeks, we're going to see that one of the most powerful lessons found in the Old Testament is found in the 3rd chapter of Ruth. If you have your Bibles and they're open, we're going to start in verse 1, chapter 1. In the day when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and his 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her sons and her husband. These 5 verses give the backdrop of the book of Ruth, and they cover 10 years of history here. And we need to understand some things about this to get the full impact of this book. So let's start with verse 1. In the day when judges ruled, in your notes, write 1350 to 1050. Now remember, we're talking BC, so the larger the number, the farther back it goes. And there's 300 years here. Those 300 years represent this. It represents that after the time that Joshua has led the Israelites into the promised land, and Joshua has now died, until the calling of the first king, which was Saul in around 1050. So you have roughly 300 years here where the way Israel is led is through judges. Now, when you think of judges in this context, don't think of them like we have them today. Think of military leaders. Because here's what would happen in that 300 years, and it would happen over and over again. After Joshua died, people were true to God for a season. They worshiped him for a season, but then they would start to fall in love with the culture around them, and they would start chasing after other gods and other things, and they would lose their passion for God. And over a period of time, God would allow a foreign nation to come in and to either oppress or maybe even take over the Israelites. They would wake up one day and say, we're in a mess. They would call out to God, and God would raise up a military leader that was called a judge. That military leader would come in and lead the Israelites out of bondage. They would then have a time of revival, and the Israelites would worship God for a season. But that pattern would be repeated once again. In fact, in your notes, you may want to write this and look it up when you get home. Judges 21, verse 25. And it says this. It says, at a time when Israel had no king, everyone did as they saw fit. And that really was what would happen during those 300 years. They would love God and they would serve him with passion, but then over time they would start doing things as they saw fit and not walking in obedience to God. You see, they knew God. They went through the motions of worship, but the truth is they valued their desires over God's directives. And I thought a couple weeks ago when I was working on this sermon, I thought if there's a verse to sum up America, that may be it right there. At a time when everyone did as they saw fit. You see, as a nation, we say we believe in God, but we want to do sexuality the way we see fit. We come to church, but we want to do our finances the way we see fit. We go through the motions of worship on the weekend, but throughout the week, we want to worship greed and power and pride and leisure and do what's right in our own eyes. And that's what's going on in Bethlehem during this time. At a time when judges ruled, there was a man from Bethlehem. Now, we're all familiar with Bethlehem because we all sing the song, right? Oh, little town of Bethlehem. But here's what you need to understand. In your notes, Bethlehem literally means house of bread. And that this family was from Bethlehem. And it means the house of bread. It was a very fertile area, that it was known for its agriculture. It was known for its grain. And yet, as we pick up this story, there's a famine in the land. And to understand why there's a famine in the land, we need to look at Deuteronomy 11, verses 13 through 15. And you may want to write that down in your notes. Deuteronomy 11, verses 13 through 15, because here's what it says, God speaking. So if you fully obey the commands I'm giving you today to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart, with all your soul, then I will send rain on your land in its seasons, both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your grain, your new wine and olive oil. I will provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. When the Israelites came into Israel, God made this promise to them. God promised them, you'll never have to worry about what you're going to eat. There's always going to be food on the table. There's always going to be wine on the shelf. There's always going to be olive oil. There will always be enough pastures and grass for your flocks and your herds to graze. It's going to be the land of blessing. And we find them in a famine. So what's going on? Well, understand this. God's promise was an if-then promise. Here's what God said. If you love me, if you put me first, if you seek me, then I promise all of these things to you. So the fact that they're going through a famine tells us what? They're in one of those times of rebellion. They're in one of those times where they're not worshiping God, and God's judgment, God's discipline has come on the land. And so it's during this time that we see that this man named Elimelech brings his family to Moab. In your notes, next to Moab, write Genesis 19:30 through 38. Let me just say this, as a church, we don't back away from truth. We don't back away from Scripture. So I'll give you the gory, detailed background of this. The Moabites was a nation right across the Dead Sea from Israel. In fact, Jerusalem to where this family settled was probably about 50 miles. And so Elimelech hears, man, there's food over in Moab. I'm just going to bring my family over to Moab. And to understand why God forbid that, the Moabites, here's how they came about. We all know in Genesis where God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And he sent the two angels and they delivered one family. Remember Lot's family. Lot left Sodom and Gomorrah with his wife and his two daughters. And when they fled Sodom and Gomorrah, God gave them one command. What was that command? Don't look back, right? Lot's wife looked back, turned into a pillar of salt. Well, we find Lot and his two daughters are living in a cave. And his daughters start looking around saying, man, there's not many men around here. We're in trouble. And so what they do is they get their father drunk. Both of them sleep with their father and have children through an incestuous relationship. And the first son who's born, his name is Moab. And he's the father of the Moabites. And the Moabites hated and despised Israel. The Moabites were Satan worshipers. They worshiped the god small g Chemosh, and they would sacrifice children to this god. And it was a heathen nation, and God had already commanded the Israelites to have nothing to do with the Moabites. It was this pagan nation that was right next to Israel and again, had tried to come in and war against Israel. So then we get to Elimelech. He's the patriarch. He's the father. He's the man of the household. He looks around and he says, there's famine in the land, but there seems to be food over in Moab. And he makes a decision to bring his family to Moab. Now, here's what we don't see. We don't see Elimelech praying and asking for God's direction. Well, really, the truth is Elimelech didn't have to pray. God had made it very clear that they were not to interact with the Moabites. But he decided he knew better than God. So he packs his family up and he moves about 50 miles away, but it couldn't be culturally more different. Now think about what that means in this move. He's taking his kids away. They'll never grow up in synagogue, and they'll never have the spiritual foundation that he had. That he's left his family, his extended family. He's left his support system of the others who trust in God. And he is taking them now to this foreign land where they're going to be alone, where his kids are going to be around other kids who worship, a demonic God, that they're not going to be taught about the God of Israel and all of these things. And he makes that choice. And why did he make that choice? For a little bit more bread. And here's why this one hits home to me. I've been at the church here 16 years, and over that time, there have been some families. Now, we've seen over 16 years a lot of families relocate for many different reasons. But I've had families come up to me and say, Chuck, this will be our last weekend. We're moving halfway across the country next week. And I'll say, well, why in the world are you moving? Well, so-and-so, my husband got a raise, and he got a new job, and they're going to pay a little bit more money, so we're going to go over there. And I'll ask him, I'll say, well, have you prayed about it? And they'll look at me like I'm nuts. No, Chuck, you don't understand. We're going to make more money there than we made here. Is there anything to pray about? Well, yeah, have you asked God whether this is his will or not? Now, I have others. In fact, I had one last week come up and say, Chuck, you know our story, man. We've been looking, we're going to be moving, and here's why, and here's God, how God showed us, and here's what was in it. Man, I sent them off with blessings. We're going to be praying for y'all and all. But these others, here's what I've heard many times. When they've made this move, we'll reconnect a little bit later. Either they'll come to Orlando for vacation, they come to church, or through Facebook or a phone call or whatever. And I can't tell you how many times over the last 16 years I've talked to somebody who was plugged into the church. Man, their kids were in children's ministry, in student ministry. They had great relationships. They were in small group. They may have even been serving. And they move across the country for a few more bucks, and I'll ask them, well, tell me about the church you're in. And there'll be an awkward pause, and they'll go, well, we still hadn't found a church. I'll say, man, you've been gone 5 years. You know, your kids who are now out of high school, man, all of what they missed. And I think Satan uses a raise every once in a while, the promise of a little bit more to dislocate us from our fellowship. Well, that's exactly what was going on with Elimelech. He decided he's going to leave and take his family 50 miles away just because they might have a little bit more bread on the table. In fact, in your notes, what's an irony about this is Elimelech's name means, my God is king. You see, he had the title, but he didn't have the lifestyle. Elimelech was king of his own life, which challenges us today. If we call ourselves Christians, we have the title, but do we have the lifestyle to match that? Then the last person here we need to know about is Naomi, Elimelech's wife. And the name Naomi means pleasant and lovely. Now, what we have to understand, in that culture, Naomi didn't have a choice in the matter. She had to follow her husband to the heathen nation. And what we're going to see is that she went in pleasant and lovely, but that's not how she's going to come out. While she's there, she watches her husband die. Now, that's a tragedy, but at least she had 2 sons. And let me tell you why that's important, because in that culture, women did not own property. Women did not, for the most part, have any kind of wealth. Women did not have a job. They were totally dependent on their husband to take care of their needs. And if the husband died, then the responsibility fell on a male child. So at least Naomi, as she buries her husband, has the security of the fact that she has 2 sons. You see, back in that culture, your Social Security system was a male relative who took care of you. And then Naomi watches her 2 sons marry foreign women, Moabites. Now, I was involved in a wedding yesterday, and it was an awesome experience. It was almost a party-type atmosphere, and 2 Christians coming together, and it was just an awesome celebration. But that's not what was going on when Naomi's sons married these 2 ladies. You know, in Jewish culture, when you had a wedding, many times the feast lasted a week. They would celebrate and party over that marriage for a week. That's not what happened here. When Naomi saw her 2 sons marry these foreign women, you know her heart had to be broken. There were no relatives coming over and giving their blessing. There was no party going on. And in fact, in Naomi's heart, she had to be heartbroken over the fact that her sons would now marry these foreign women. And then after that, she stands at the graveside of both of her sons. And now we see a foreign woman in a foreign land. We see Naomi in Moab with 2 daughter-in-laws in the house and out of options. And that's where we pick up in verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Isn't it amazing how clear God's will is when we run out of options? Naomi has no options left, and so here's what she determines. I'm going to go back to the place where God's blessing is. And here's what I see. I see many times we take matters in our own hands, and we kind of ignore God until the marriage is a mess. And then we kind of come back. Our finances are upside down, and then we come back. Our kids rebel, and then we come back. Somebody's diagnosed terminal, and then we come back. Now listen, God's grace is the kind of grace that accepts us back at any moment. But isn't it a shame that we have to go through Moab sometimes to get there? Naomi was in a place she never should have been. But at least she's going to return to the place where she can find God's blessing. We keep going. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you and to your people." Now, here's what's not written in there. I think Naomi loved these 2 girls. I think Naomi understood life was going to be tough enough for her back in Bethlehem, but it was going to be extremely hard for a Moabite to live in Bethlehem. They were enemies of Israel. And I think out of love, she's saying, "Look, guys, it's better for you to stay here." We keep going. But now, verse 11, but Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands?" Now understand, in that culture, here was the rule, that if a man died and he didn't have a son, but he had a brother, it was the brother's responsibility to marry his sister-in-law, to give his sister-in-law a son, and that son was the son of the dead brother and not the son of the brother-in-law who married her. That son would then carry on the dead brother's line and legacy and name and all of that. And so she's saying here, look, I'm not going to have any more sons. Now, let me ask you this. As soon as you hear about that in that culture, how many of y'all are happy that's not the way it works today, right? But that's the way it was, okay? And so she's saying, I'm not going to have any more sons who are going to, you're going to be able to marry to give you sons. And even if I did, would you wait around that long? She goes on to say, "Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband and tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Boy, listen to that last line. Here's what Naomi's saying. It's all God's fault. It's all God's fault. God took my husband, God took my sons, and now God is punishing me. Isn't it amazing how we can make a mess of our life and try to blame it on God? Let me say this. You will never go down the wrong road and end up at the place of God's blessing. And so what I want to point out here in your notes is I want us to look at dead ends and famines can be caused by four ways. When we find ourselves in a mess, there's four ways to look at that mess. Sometimes in your notes, the mess that we're in is a mess that we made. And I would say in all of our lives, there are times where the mess we're in is the mess that we made. We overspend our credit cards and we're wondering why we're in financial burden. We embrace a sin and it's destroying us and we wonder why there's no joy in our lives. We toyed with something and then became addicted to it and wonder why we can't let go of that. We have choices daily that we make to disobey God rather than to walk in obedience to God, and we wonder why we're in the mess we're in. Let me tell you, you can't blame God for a mess that you made. That's why he gave us his word. He says, let me teach you how to walk in the way of blessing to prevent you from making this mess of your life. Sometimes the mess we're in is a mess we've made. Sometimes the mess we're in is a mess someone else made. And quite honestly, that's a lot of what's going on with Naomi. She had no choice when Elimelech said, pack your bags, we're leaving. She had to follow her husband, and now she's getting the backwash of her husband's disobedience to God. And not just her husband. When her husband died, her sons could have said, let's go back home where we belong, but they didn't. They instead married foreign women, and now Naomi is dealing with the results of somebody else's poor decisions. And all of us, at some time in our life, have had the same thing happen to us. Somebody's betrayed us. Somebody's cheated on us. Somebody's lied about us. And we found ourselves in a mess of somebody else's making. And we were caught in the backwash of that. Maybe you grew up in the home and a parent was an alcoholic or was unfaithful. And you know the pain of being caught in the backwash of somebody else's sins. The third, sometimes a mess is setting the stage for a miracle. Think about this. God led the Israelites out of Egypt, and he puts them right next to the Red Sea, and the Egyptian army is following them. And in their eyes, they're in a mess. But all that was God setting them up for a miracle, for the Red Sea to part, for them to cross through on dry land, and then for the sea to come back and destroy the Egyptian army. Or when they're wandering the wilderness and they're complaining about not having water and food, and that all God was doing was setting for a miracle, and he sends water from a rock to give water for millions of people and all their livestock, and sends manna and quail. Or how about Joseph, who determines that he's not going to compromise, he's going to be obedient to God and not sleep with Potiphar's wife. Next thing you know, he finds himself in prison, but it was in that prison that God used that mess to make Joseph number 2 in all of Egypt, and to bring the Israelites out of his family out of famine into the land of Goshen, the land of plenty. Sometimes the mess we're in, we just need to be faithful, trust God, because he may be using that for a miracle. And then lastly, sometimes the mess is just life. We live in a broken, fallen world. There is always going to be death. There's always going to be deceit. There is always going to be disaster. There are always going to be consequences to living in this world. And sometimes it's just life. And that's where we have to trust God. Even if we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he is with us. His rod and his arm, they lead us. And so we just have to trust him through that. Let's keep going, verse 14. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth said, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. A very popular verse sometimes at weddings. And then she says, your people would be my people and your God, my God. Here's one of the encouraging things I find in chapter 1, that God can even redeem our screw-ups. Naomi, Elimelech, the boy should have never been in Moab. And yet God used that experience somehow so that Ruth would come to put her faith in the God of Israel. In fact, what we see at the end of this chapter, Ruth has more faith in God than Naomi does. And Ruth is saying, no, your God is my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Remember, Naomi meant pleasant. Mara means bitter. She says, "Don't even call me pleasant. Call me bitter." And it's all God's fault. "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And that last verse is going to be critical to next week. But as we close, here's how I want us to close. What do you do if you find yourself far away from God? What do you do if you find yourself in a place that you're not supposed to be? Now, we're not necessarily talking physically like this family being in Moab, but spiritually, emotionally, relationally. What do you do when you know you're not where you're supposed to be? You're not in the place of God's blessing. Well, two things I put in your notes. Number one, pursue obedience more than comfort. Pursue obedience more than comfort. Elimelech chose comfort over obedience. He knew God had forbid them to go to Moab, but he chose comfort over obedience. Let me say this very clearly. This goes against what prosperity gospel preachers preach. And let me say this. If you have to add a word before gospel, it's not the gospel. All right? So understand this. God's ways are not always the easiest ways, but they are the best. God's ways are, in fact, if you follow God, sometimes following God is going to cause you to make some decisions that are very hard and hard on you and hard on your family. But that's the place where you meet God. That's the place where God's blessing is. It's not always the easiest, but it is the best. Choose obedience over comfort. And then secondly, it begins with faith and honesty. You have to believe and have faith that God still is the answer, that God still is working. Faith that he will keep his promises. Faith that if we seek him, we will find him if we seek him with all of our heart. Faith that Jesus meant it when he said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Faith to believe that God meant it when he said, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." You have to have faith that God still is the answer. And then secondly, you need to be honest with what it is that caused you the drift in the first place. Why is it that you're so far away from God? What idols or other gods are in your life? What sin are you chasing after? Why is there a lack of passion in your life? Be honest and bring that to God. When you pursue obedience more than comfort, when you know God is the answer and put your faith in him and honestly go to him, that's the place where miracles begin.